Thank you for joining. I'm going to talk on the topic today are age gap relationships and marriages. Are they forbidden? And so, what does the Bible have to say that relates to this topic? And let's think through some of the issues here. Got a little light spot here somehow. I'm not sure where that glare is coming from, but it's not a halo. I guess it's a light refracting. That's fine. So, anyway, let's talk about it. What does the Bible say about the issue? Well, the Bible doesn't say you can't marry somebody that's younger than you or you can't marry somebody that's older than you. It doesn't recommend a particular age gap for getting married. Um, I don't really have a direct dog in this fight. My parents were maybe about 10 years apart. That's about the closest thing to it. My wife and I are 3 years apart. I was 27 when we got married. We were pretty close in age, not the exact same age, but we didn't have a huge age gap. But I'll see or hear things or read somebody say online that if somebody's 20 and they're dating a 29-year-old or 30-year-old or whatever, that he's grooming you and this is predatory behavior. And usually they say that if it's a man dating a younger woman, even though traditionally that was more acceptable than the opposite way around. But that's something that seems to be kind of new, or the idea of it being sort of immoral or something to have a date age gap seems to be either new or sort of intensifying in our culture. Well, what does the Bible say? The Bible doesn't specifically say thou shalt marry someone younger or thou shalt marry someone older. It's not like that in the scriptures, but we do have some examples. And one example is that if you kind of calculate how old Isaac was when he got married, he would have been at least 40. He might have been 41 or whatever, but he's about 40 years old. Or wait, I'm not sure if he has the exact age, but you can look through there and figure out he's 40. He's got a 4 in front of his age there. And he marries a damsel. Now, a damsel, maybe that's a late teen, maybe it's a 20-year-old. It's a young woman. Okay, so he marries a young virgin woman, and Abraham sends his servant and he prays that the Lord would send an angel before the servant. The servant has this very specific prayer that the woman that Isaac gets to marry would, when he asked for water at the well, that she would offer to water his camels. Apparently, camels can drink quite a bit, and they'd been on a journey, so that would have been a very generous and very huge task for her to offer to do that. And then he discovers that she's from Abraham's clan and that she's a good candidate for Isaac to marry, and they determine this is from the Lord. She agrees to it, and her family agrees to it, and she goes off and she gets married to Isaac. So, anyway, that's an age gap marriage. Another age gap marriage that we know about in the Bible that Boaz, Ruth married an Israelite. They were in the land of Moab. I think they're escaping a famine. This Jewish family, and the sons marry Moabite daughters, and one of the two sons die. One of the Moabite, I believe the husband was dead too, and then Naomi is the mother-in-law. One of the when the two sons die, one of the daughter-in-laws goes off and stays in the land of Moab, and one of them says that she wants to stay with Naomi, and your people might be my people, and your God will be my God. And she goes, and then there is a close relative under the Jewish under the Old Testament law. Um, the closest relative, male relative, would marry the widow. And so there was a man named Boaz who wasn't the closest relative. He was the next closest relative to Ruth, and the other relative passed up on it. And so he married her. So anyway, he said to her that she could have gone after one of the younger men. She expressed some interest in him. And so, anyway, apparently he was older than her. There was some kind of age gap. We don't know what it was. But I've read the theory that Mary may have been a teenager and Joseph might have been 30. I was reading something from Gordon Fee recently, who's a theologian and who does a lot of kind of like cultural digging in the past. And he said, I believe he said something about Egyptian information, or maybe there's some records or something from Egypt that indicated that was a typical age gap. And I don't know if he was dealing with the Jewish community over there. And so they're kind of extrapolating that's how marriages may have happened. And so then they extrapolate that maybe Mary and Joseph had this age gap, or maybe Joseph, there's some tradition, maybe Joseph was a bit older than that. Whatever the case, it's not forbidden in the Bible for there to be an age gap between men and women, and when they get married. Now, my concern about this is it's not something that's restricted. It's not something that's forbidden. But then you get people creating new morality where it can actually conflict with biblical morality. And that's my area of concern. I'm not saying that you should marry 100. If you're 20, you should marry a 20-year-old woman, you should marry a 100-year-old man. And I'm not going to say if you're a 100-year-old woman that you should marry a 20-year-old man. But if there's no other factor there, it's not a sin to do so. Now, if I'm 20, I'm not going to want to marry a 100-year-old woman, or I wasn't going to want to marry 60 or 50 or whatever. I wanted to marry a young woman when I was 20. Aesthetically, it wasn't very pleasing to me. And also, practically, if I want to have kids, a woman couldn't be too old, to marry somebody who's 55 or whatever, chances of having children is pretty slim without some medical intervention. And even with it, if you marry a woman that age. So, there's some practicalities if you want to have children. And, you could even, let's say a 20-year-old woman marries a 45-year-old man. And then she thinks, well, how old will he be at the children's graduation? 63 or whatever, may not be that old to be at a college graduation if they have a baby right away. And that's kind of old for that. But even if you marry a young man, he's not guaranteed life. And if you marry an old man, he's not guaranteed to die before the kids graduate from school. Of course, aesthetically, practically, less of an age gap may make sense. There's all those types of issues. So, I'm not saying that you need to go marry somebody a lot older, somebody a lot younger. I'm just saying it's not a sin in the Bible. Now, where does it become a problem? Where I think it becomes a problem is if there is a couple that are married, and they're righteously married, they did everything right according to scripture, everything is okay. And then you have people accepting these new social mores against that it's almost like a sin or immoral, or that it's grooming, even though they're both adults, for him to marry her, and they treat it like the marriage is not legitimate. Okay, so then that type of thinking can undermine people and discourage them in their marriage, and maybe encouraging them towards sin. So let's say that some woman comes over to this young woman and says, oh, he groomed you, you shouldn't be married to a 30-year-old man or 50-year-old man or whatever. He groomed you, and this is bad, this is wrong, when really there's nothing wrong with it. And the woman who is encouraging this other woman to divorce or separate, or just casting these doubts or creating stress in her mind, from her talking like this, is promoting something evil, or not encouraging her in her marriage. And I think part of the reason we have this kind of shift about age gaps, and this, at least in this particular area, that treating a marriage is less than, or is not legitimate over this, is because we don't really live as much in a culture that appreciates the concept of holy matrimony as we used to. We live in a culture that's more disposable marriage, that if you just get a divorce for whatever reason, there's not even it's legal, but there's not even social censure about it. It's not considered shameful. It's not considered a wicked thing to do, just to leave your spouse because you say, oh, I don't feel the love, I'm not getting the butterflies, I'm not extracting the feelings off of you that I want to get from you, so I'm going to leave you. Then and I can't use you for feelings and dopamine hits anymore. It's just not working. That's supposed to be love, is to get the dopamine hit as opposed to being committed to the other person for life. Then that's a problem. Now, where does this type of thinking come from? My theory is that there were probably some feminist women who spent their 20s up in their career, or protesting, or just sleeping around with different men, and then they get upset when they're at 35 and they're not as fertile as they used to be. And the other 35-year-old men that kind of still look young, and still want to have kids, then they say, well, I want to have kids, I'll marry a woman in my 20s who hasn't been with a lot of other guys. Okay, that could be one scenario. And so then the woman says, hey, you should be attracted to women your own age. And, that could be one scenario. Another could be, women that left their husbands and then they're looking for a second husband, and the men, they have an option, that still have an option to date down into the 20s. And men, I think there's still kind of maybe it's an older cultural thing, that men might be a little more uncomfortable with dating the older woman who's kind of at the than the women are with dating the older men. In some cultures, it's that way. So I don't think it's a sin to date or marry a woman who's older than you. Of course, that's not a sin. Now, I do think it's kind of ironic. Certainly, if Christians think this way, if you see there's a couple where the husband leaves his wife because she doesn't make him, he's not excited with that anymore, and the wife leaves her husband to go find herself, and they both get a divorce, and then they find somebody else to marry, and then they're both 30, 35 years old, and they marry each other, and then you have people who think, oh, that's no big deal. But then you have a 30-year-old virgin who marries a 20-year-old virgin, and their parents agree to it, their families are on board. They wait until marriage to have sex and don't fornicate before marriage, and they do things right. And then you have people say, "Oh, he's grooming her. He's a PDF file because she's 20 years old or something like that." No, I think that's a really skewed. That's accepting kind of morality of this present evil age. The Bible doesn't say there's a certain age at which you're allowed to get married. Adulthood is largely a cultural concept. I know when I went to Indonesia at the time, I think 17 was adult over there. I believe in the 90s. I think they've kind of changed the legal age of adulthood, maybe. I'm not sure. But anyway, and if you went to some country and it was 21 or 20 or whatever, and then that's when someone could legally marry or whatever, that would be a cultural thing. Over in the United States, in the United States, it's 18 years old. I think as far as age of marriage, it says love your neighbor as you love yourself, and we have general concern for people. If a girl is too young to have children without some health problems from being so young and not developed physically as a woman, I think that's a good reason for women not to marry at that age. And so 18 years old is I think it's a good number for adulthood. That's just my ethical reasoning. The Bible doesn't comment on it. And if I got ancestors, I look at the genealogy, they got married in their late teens or whatever. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not going to judge my ancestors as being predators or something or whatever. Another really skewed thing about our culture is that there are people who say, like the 30-year-old man dating a 20-year-old girl is the predator, but then they're totally okay with teenagers fornicating and then want to give them, birth control devices or something. And that's skewed thinking. I don't want my children. I have adult children, male, one boy, and I have girls also, and teenagers, teenagers and adult. One's teen and one's both teen and adult, right? But I don't want them fornicating with anybody. I want them to wait until marriage. I don't care how old the person is. They're not supposed to fornicate with them if they're young or if they're old. Um, Another thing about ethics of marriage in the Old Testament, we see that the fathers gave the daughters in marriage, and in the Jewish culture there was a bride price, or in the Old Testament law there's a bride price that was a part of that. And so in the New Testament it also talks about giving in marriage. And so the idea that the father of the bride gives her in marriage is a biblical concept as well. And I'm more concerned about things like that than what the age gap is between husband and wife. I would rather if I would rather have one of my children get married at 22 to a 35-year-old who had never been married, especially if he had kept himself for marriage, who loves God, than to marry another than to marry a guy who's 23 who is divorced. I'd rather be concerned with these biblical issues than with some of the age gap issues as a dad, just for my own children's well-being. Now, is my personal preference. If you ask me, would you rather the kids marry somebody really far apart in age? No, no. But if they did, I think it's kind of hard enough to find somebody for a lot of people that you really click with. It's kind of fits your criteria. And as a believer, you want someone who loves God, someone who lives a sexually moral life. That's one thing, and someone who's dedicated to staying married for life. And then there's that whole thing of just finding somebody that you're attracted to, not just the physical side of things, but also that emotional side of things. Some of the rhetoric I've read kind of about this is I've read this phrase that why aren't men attracted to, that something's wrong with a man who's not attracted to a woman his own age. And I'm thinking this is probably a woman who's reached a certain age and maybe the men aren't attracted to her. I wonder if she says that. Now, I don't remember the details or what the name of the statistics was, but or the name of the study was, or whatever, and what the exact age ranges was. But I was reading about some research that was done, and they asked men at different ages. They showed them pictures of women, and they said which women are most attractive. And the women that they all rated most attractive, the men in their 20s, men in their 30s, men in their 40s, up to 60s, or whatever age group it went up to, they all rated the women like in their 20s. It's like 21, 26, or whatever. Those are the most attractive women on a scale of 1 to 10. And then as it got older, it started decreasing the amount of attractiveness. Then they asked the women, and the women, if the woman is 40, she's going to pick a man. She's going to see these young men and the older men. She's going to pick the man that's close to her in age, maybe a little bit older than her, maybe the same age. And so I don't know if men and women's perceptions of what is actually physically attractive is different, and that men's is just like, oh, this is objective. They're more attractive when they're young, and then if the women are more like, um, kind of that plays into their actual perception of attraction as a closeness of age. So that probably has something to do with choice of spouse, that a lot of men try to get the most attractive woman that they can in terms of age. And of course, physical attraction is not the only thing. So of course, people will marry other people that are closer in age to themselves that they can relate to. And there's other types of, we can call, attraction besides just physical looks and things like that as well. So anyway, I just encourage you, if you're judging people based on how far apart they are in age, especially if they aren't already married, don't do that. We need to encourage each other, and uh, encourage each other to walk right with the Lord. And so if you know some people who are married and there's a age gap, you don't just discourage them in their marriage because of that. And if you know some people that are dating and they're 10 years apart or 15 years apart or whatever, you don't have to go blurting your opinions out if they're not really based on anything moral or ethical. I would much rather you do that if you say, hey, this guy is separated, or even this guy's divorced, and he could go back to his wife and reconcile that, put the family back together. And here's what Jesus taught on it. Here's what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say don't marry somebody who's older, younger than you, or whatever. And neither did Moses in the Torah. Nothing in the Bible condemns age gaps in marriage. It's not an issue, that makes a marriage moral or immoral. So, I mean, there may be some stigma or whatever, and you may think about it in terms of how you get along in society. You may also think about whether you can relate to somebody. Now, as far as like relating to someone of a different age, I could see that, that if they're both grown adults, that somebody could be 40 and somebody could be 25 or whatever, and they could get along well with each other. And I think men also are probably, the things that appeal to women and a man and the things that appeal to a man and a woman are different enough, to where like a man would like a woman who admires him, that would attract him, that respects him. And so some of the age may play into that as well. Also, if someone's youthful and fun or whatever, that could feel kind of invigorating, or whatever. And of course, there are predatory type situations. We're not to engage in any kind of sexual immorality, no sex outside of marriage, and that sort of thing. And so, yes, an older person may know more, or maybe more clever or more bold about manipulating a younger person into immorality. And so that is a concern in some relationships. That can be a concern in some relationships. But just because there's an age gap doesn't mean that the intentions are ignoble or predatory. And if the intention is to, have a godly marriage, then it's not your kids, not your family. Then you be careful with your opinions about something that's not an issue of morality. Now, maybe if some young woman is your friend, asks you about it, what do you think? Should I date this old guy or this young guy? And she asks for your opinion. You could give your opinion, but don't look down and condemn people for things that aren't sinful. That's basically what I think about this. And I've noticed a trend of more of a negativity towards this idea. And there's one idea I meant to mention that I hadn't heard, that I wanted to bring up. The line of reasoning is that young women's brains don't develop until they get to be 25. Maybe that's based on some kind of research. I don't know. It could be just the human brain, or maybe it's 26, whatever the number is. And so therefore, they're being predatory if an older man is going after a woman at this young age where he can mold her or whatever. If young women are not able to make decisions about marriage until they're 25 or 26, then why would our society, if our society hasn't intervened and stopped them from dating an older man, why let them date a younger man? Okay, so if they're going to make foolish decisions at 23 or whatever, there's a high probability of it, so you want to keep them away from the older man. What about the younger man? I mean, there are teenagers who will date, and then the either the boy or the girl controls the kid, the other kid, and they're like really concerned about pleasing the boyfriend or the girlfriend. I've seen both. Um, and then instead of honoring the parents as they should and being a part of their family, and even in the teenage years. And so that can be a unhealthy dynamic with that, with young partners. And when I see people make that argument about girls until they're 26 or whatever, fertility wise, you're cutting into fertility years. At some point, you reach adulthood. 23 is probably a good year to have a baby if you want to have a baby young and have a lot of kids. Some people want to have a lot of kids. So, that's 22. Those are prime fertility ages, and women have a little bit more concern about that. It's maybe 10-year whatever it is, that they're earlier, that it becomes even an issue for men typically. So that it's earlier for women, that then it's an issue for men to be able to have kids. So anyway, I'm thinking, if the women are so unable to make any kind of decisions, why don't we just have a protector who screens and sees who they can date? And maybe the dad can make sure no woman dates or marries until she's 26. We can have more patriarchy to handle this. I think I've suggested this online, because some of the people that want to protect the women from the predatory guys kind of seem to be feminists. So I just throw that out there. But anyway, that's yeah, it is good if parents are involved in the dating decision, and certainly the marriage decision. The Bible does say in Jeremiah, when the Israelites, or Judah, was about to go into captivity, it says, "Find wives for your sons and husbands for your daughters." So again, it's telling the parents to match the kids up, or to find someone for them to marry. So I mean, my kids meet somebody they like, and I can get to know them and approve it. I don't have to go out and find somebody behind a bush and pull them out and say, "Hey, marry this one," or whatever, or find some guy in this culture. It's kind of hard to do that. I think it's good, and then some cultures have that, but of course, I want something my kids, adult children, that they would like. So I'm okay with them matching up and meeting godly partners, and then I'm involved in getting to know them, and playing a role as a dad and helping screen and encourage, and things like that, and give some feedback. I've got one that's getting ready to marry here soon, and so it's a happy time. So, and they're close in age too. They're about as far apart as me and their mother. As my daughter and her boyfriend, about as far apart in age as I am with my wife. So about a 3-year gap. So that's turned out that way. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching the video. Feel free to share this with other people. You can click subscribe, click like if you like it. And yeah, so just if you know people that are married, and be encouraging of other people's marriages. That's something that's really under a lot of attack right now. We don't need other man-made excuses for making people have more difficulty in their marriages and in their lives. And so that's my main concern with that. Thanks a lot.